Okay, hi guys. So I made this video to sort of show how someone can discern that Catholicism is a true religion. I recognize that it's a very politically incorrect video, but I think it's still very useful material to show how someone can like rationally justify why they would become Catholic. So basically there are three main steps to Catholicism. So first is that you have to answer the question whether God exists or not, right? Then once you go there, to answer, you have to ask which religion is the true one. Once you conclude with Christianity, you have to ask the question, which version of Christianity? Because there are different versions. And then from there, you get to Catholicism. So the first thing, just to establish is that objective truth exists. So relativism is self-defeating. The idea that everything is subjective, that itself is an objective statement. So it's self-defeating. Truth we understand as that which conforms to reality. And it is our minds that conform to reality, not that reality conforms to our mind. Right? Our minds simply recognize and acknowledge reality. And nobody can really live like a relativist. If you ask a relativist to really just jump off a building, suddenly he won't act like a relativist because intuitively he knows that he will be harmed if he jumps off a building, right? Objectively speaking. Yeah. So on to the first question, does God exist or not? So some arguments here. So just as a very common sense and intuitive way of knowing, we can all see that something cannot come from nothing. When we see the universe around us, right? There's also kind of reason that there had to be a cause. And yeah, the higher cannot come about by the lower. Um, and religion is also a primitive, universal, and constant phenomenon in the life of nations. So we can discern that it's actually in man's nature. It's not something arbitrary that came out of nowhere. We can also recognize the intricate universe ordered towards certain ends. So this is the telos, the teleology where things are directed towards a certain end. Uh, shows a sense of purpose as well that's imbued into the universe. And life would be really utterly meaningless without God. Because if everything is just a cosmic accident, then there really is no objective meaning in life. But nobody really lives like that. Same for objective morality. Morality can't be grounded uh, at all if everything is just an accident as well. There's no meaning to life anyway, right? But everybody has a conscience. Everybody innately knows, or at least acts like their objective right and wrong really do exist, right? Yeah, and religious societies are also shown to be happier than those who are not religious. That's something to consider. Seems suggests that being religious is really part of our nature. Yeah. And another argument from contingency. So contingent just means just take it as just to mean dependent. So everything in the universe, if it's contingent, dependent, right? Ultimately, you have to be grounded in something that's not contingent, something that's necessary. And that we can discern to be something that's timeless, spaceless, and all-powerful being. Timeless because existed before time, existed before space, all-powerful to be able to create and create the whole universe, right? And that's so you can see the argument here. I think there's no one who can honestly live like there's no God. No one can be firmly and honestly convinced of God's non-existence. There's really no conclusive argument against God's existence. Okay, you can't really prove that. And it's ingrained in the human heart. And because it has a tremendous consequence on life and death, it it answers the biggest questions on destiny, purpose, meaning, and morality, right? So you just can't ignore it. It's not something that you can just put aside or brush aside as useless. Yeah. Another thing is the idea of causality. Um, every effect is proportionate to its cause, right? The higher cannot come about by the lower. So these are philosophical principles. So seeing that the cause of the universe created life, consciousness, intelligence, right? The cause of the universe also must possess life, consciousness, intelligence, but in a superior degree, right? So the higher cannot come about by the lower. Yeah. I think from all that, right, we get that it's at least quite possible, quite plausible that God exists, right? And later we'll look into this a bit more, but also seeing that that there are many verified miracles in the Catholic Church, they will look into, it does show that God exists, because the miracles really can't be explained by any other way than the fact of God, because they completely transcend the creator order. Yeah. And it's also true certainty which consists in this, that when the matter is fairly presented to a sensible man's consideration, we can see no reason for prudently refusing his assent. So this is what we mean here by certainty. Right. And you can see over here in Pascal's wager, it makes more sense to actually believe in God anyway. Right. I have to also acknowledge that this is not just a wholly intellectual exercise, because we are persons, we have a mind and a heart. So the heart also plays a role. Some people who are insincere, they can choose to flood their mind with objections, while they're choosing to disregard the cogent aspects of the arguments for God, so that they can willfully delude themselves. Although some may be simply sincerely mistaken. Okay, so we'll look into that a bit. So the mind and the heart. So we have to recognize that what is in our mind affects our heart, and what is in our heart affects our mind. So there's this intrinsic and inseparable connection between our intellect and our will, the heart and the mind. So basically, a sound mind and a sound heart, a sincere heart, is required to find the truth. That cannot be ignored. Right? So yeah, basically a sound heart, sound mind, and a sincere heart is needed. So of course, this will be ideal to find the truth. This is, I guess you could say, the prerequisite. Then the other variations is that um some people may have a sound mind but an insincere heart. Right? People might think it's all about having a good mind. It's not. If you are too proud to acknowledge that you may be wrong or something, then you won't be able to find the truth as well. Then another group could be those who have both an unsound mind and an unsound heart. So that's the worst of all. But the unsound mind, it can be either culpable or inculpable. So so it can be inculpable, so not your fault, if you're really born with like a mental defect or something, right? But it will be culpable if um it arose from your own ill will, your own slothfulness, or deliberate negligence for something that you know you should be looking into, right? That resulted in your ignorance, right? Yeah. And the last category is those with a sincere heart, right? But they still made an error in their judgment. They still made a mistake. So for these, um, as long as they were sincere in their search but still made a mistake, there's still a possibility of them being saved by God, right? But this is already presupposing Catholic theology, but we will get to there later. But it's just something to keep in mind, that we can't ignore this aspect, and we can't forget that people do have a lot of these things like secret pride inside of them, ill will, anger, sloth, deliberate negligence, bitter resentment, maybe past hurts, past wounds. So these are things that we shouldn't be forgetting and we should check our motives whenever we look into these things regarding truth. Yeah. And I think atheism really is a heart problem rather than a head problem. So you can see this. This is just honestly too true. This other meme, only believe in God because he feels your existential needs. But if God exists, that's exactly what we would expect, right? I think ultimately what it comes down to is that any atheist, especially the militant kind, or at least the new atheist movement, right? They just don't want God to be real. The reason for that is because obedience to God requires total self-abnegation, requires humility. You can't indulge in your sinful, immoral lifestyles and habits, and you're forced to be accountable to your guilty conscience, from pride and just the inconvenient truth of having to do all these things, right? You can see that many people also become atheists in their teens when their sensual desires are at their strongest. So now moving on to step two. So which religion? For this part, it gets especially politically incorrect. So now talk about which religion. So we'll consider the main religions in the world. So Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Judaism. And yeah, we can just see the ratio here. And Christianity is the biggest religion. So just something to see is that Christianity is the most evenly dispersed religion. It's not just for uh, a certain ethnic group. It's not just for a certain culture, but it's just dispersed throughout the whole world. It sort of gives you the idea of the universality of the religion, not just a cultural thing. You can see that a lot of the other religions, they're like geographically fixed, right? They're always in a certain geography, which seems to be influenced a lot by more of like a cultural or social thing, rather than universal and objectively binding truth. So that's just something to take note of. So we have to compare God-made vs man-made religion. So that there should be an enormous difference between a religion that's God-made and self-made and man-made, right? So you can see here, because and it should be fairly easy to tell the difference, because one is infinitely transcendent, one is actually objectively true and it's divine. The other is just man-made. There should be a massive and obvious difference. So what I'm trying to say here is that the true religion cannot have even one valid objection against it because it's true, right? That's one way to conceptualize it. That the if it really is divine, there cannot be even a single valid objection against it, right? And one objection against it that's valid is really a death blow to the whole system and shows that it's a fallible human system, not divine. So that's something to expect. Now we can look at the different religious groups. So one is that it's one type of group is that the polytheistic group, right? So they say that there are multiple gods. Then there's a monotheistic group. It says that there's only one God. So now we'll show that why there cannot be more than one God. Okay. So if we take the idea that God is an infinite being, okay, we'll say that he's infinite because he created the world from nothing. To create something from nothing requires infinite power. So we'll take it for granted that God is an infinite being. And if there are two infinite beings, that means one lacks something that the other has. And that's why they're different. Because if yeah, so that's basically how you can tell the difference between people, right? When one person lacks something the other doesn't have. So one of them, since one God, since it lacks something, is not infinite and is not God. So only one infinite being is possible. Okay, and also the idea of two infinite beings will prevent the beings from being omnipotent if they build two contradictory things, because they'll cancel each other out. So God A says, let it rain tomorrow. God B says, let it be sunny tomorrow. Then they won't be able to um accomplish their will. So it cuts against their omnipotence also. Yeah. So that's just a quick way to sort of see that monotheism is the way to go. Another conception of God is that the whole universe is God. Universe equals God, right? But if we accept this, right, it will destroy morality because every action in the universe, even the immoral actions of men, killing people and all that, is just an action of the self-same God. That will mean that everything is permissible, right? And God will be also indifferent to good and evil, committing evils just as he commits good things, or he does good actions. So you will lose the basis to condemn the gravest immorality. And intuitively, we all know that we are not God, we are finite, right? And we have no knowledge that we are God. So that also shows that it doesn't quite make sense to say that the whole universe, including everything inside of it, is God. Also recognizing that the universe is material, finite, and had a beginning, right? It just shows you that it can't really be God, who has to be a transcendent cause. And we saw that from the argument from contingency, for example. Yeah. And I guess science also shows that the universe had a beginning. Another common thing you'll hear a lot is that all paths lead to the same end, right? All religions just lead to the same end. But actually, this is quite a death blow. If you maintain it, it is kind of a death blow to your own position because it's impossible because different religions contradict each other's teachings, so they're mutually exclusive. So they cannot lead to the same end. So for example, Islam says Jesus is not God. Christianity says Jesus is God. There's no other way out of it, right? Jesus says he's the only way. Hinduism, for example, says there are multiple ways. And there's plenty of other mutually exclusive claims regarding the afterlife and all that. So to assert that two conflicting positions are in fact correlative is not only irrational but untruthful, right? And everybody recognizes this. So now we can see that monotheism is the way to go. And that already actually already lessens the options to just these three main religious groups. Okay, so now we'll see the different religions individually and sort of show the demerits of religions. Yeah, this is not to be offensive, but just to assess the various claims fairly and just to look into them. Yeah, so Buddhism is pantheistic and polytheistic. So we already established that those aren't very convincing. You can't. It's not a position you can really maintain. They also says that all contradictory paths lead to the same end, and we already showed that that's also impossible. Buddhism itself has various offshoots, and is itself an offshoot of Hinduism. There's like Mahayana Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism. Theravada Buddhism would be more conservative, right? And so the idea is just is just that the different offshoots, they do say they have different teaching. So the question is, which teaching should we be subscribing to, right? So it's not very clear on that also. Um, Buddha himself did not claim to be divine at all. He was also an agnostic at best. That's something to consider because if we are starting a religion that talks about things about the afterlife and all that, and your founder didn't believe in God, something that raises your eyebrows. Buddha himself, he didn't do any miracles. Okay, he wasn't divine or anything, as he says himself. And the historical life of Buddha is also quite sketchy. So the earliest records of his life are roughly 500 years after he died. Okay, so scholars agree that he existed, but also agree that there is no way of knowing whether the events of his life as depicted reflect historical truth. So 500 years before, only 500 years later, sorry, was his life recorded, right? And so that's why you'll see that there are actually contradictory um, stories about his life. Things about karma and reincarnation, they are unverifiable. And sometimes the concern is that if we take the idea of karma, we see people born with defects, right? Then someone might say that it was because of his previous life that he did something evil, and that's why he's deserving of uh punishment in this life by being born with a defect. And if someone perhaps is born with in a better state, and in his previous life he was doing well, this can sort of influence your idea of morality, and can a sense of self-righteousness can also creep in. So this is something to think about. But of course, I recognize that Buddhism is also very broad. But yeah, that's just something to note. Because then for Hinduism, it's also pantheistic and polytheistic. It also says that all contradictory paths lead to the same end, similar to Buddhism. It also gave rise to the caste system where different parts of different echelons in society are basically discriminated against, not conducive for societal development. There's also no standard for orthodoxy, right? There's no standard for what exactly is Hinduism, what exactly are its beliefs. There are actually many contradictory types of Hinduism, and they're all lumped together as Hinduism, right? And that's how they supposedly maintain unity, but it's not really unity. It's just that a label of Hinduism is put on them. But yeah, there's really no standard for orthodoxy, right? And Hinduism and Buddhism, similarly, they avoid conflict. But at the same time, you welcome when you avoid conflict and accept everyone. It sounds good, but what you end up doing is you accept even immoral ways of life, and it also allows for superstitious practices. There are various understanding of how these practices are to be maintained, right? But superstitious practices, uh, uh, generally speaking, cannot be rationally maintained by anyone. Yeah, and there's also a national religion. It's not universally spreading. There's virtually no effort of spreading at all outside of India. Um, Not that this falsifies Hinduism, but if it is the true religion for the whole world, right? And we already see that not all paths can lead to the same end. It's something to think about that it's just mainly a cultural thing. It seems to suggest that it's mainly a cultural thing rather than something divine. So now we'll look at Islam. So Muhammad himself did not perform any miracles, and he himself confessed that. So he didn't show any credentials that we can worthily trust in him. He also came 600 years after Jesus, okay, and says that Jesus was never crucified. But this contradicts all previous sources that were even much closer to Jesus' time, that basically unanimously attest to the fact that Jesus was crucified, okay. And Muslims claim that the Bible was corrupted over time, but we this is just factually false. We still have the manuscripts that show and the commentaries, for example, by the early church fathers that show that the New Testament is really and the Bible is perfectly preserved. And this idea is really rejected by the scholarly community. It cannot be maintained. So this holding these positions is like a death blow to your own position. And Muhammad himself was a warlord. He gained numbers through military conquest and subjugations. There's a lot of human political means. And the Quran also has scriptural basis to teach that you should kill all those who do not believe. Okay. So 50%, 57% of religious wars come from Islam. And the Islamic extremists, the terrorists, also use these verses to support um their way of this terrorizing people. It permits child marriage and polygamy, okay, and of up to 4 wives. Muhammad himself married a 9-year-old, and he owned, sold, and bought slaves. And there are also grammatical mistakes reported in the Quran. To some grammarians, they criticize the Quran because Islam claims that its only miracle is that it's the Quran is something so beautiful. It's a literary masterpiece. But yeah, grammarians shows that there are grammatical mistakes in there. So yeah, you can see some of the also the verses in the footnotes that do suggest um uh violence against non-believers. There actually is significant support. That's something to consider. I'm not saying all Muslims support to, not that they actually hold to the idea of killing people who don't believe, but there is some sort of basis to show that, although um different Muslim groups will interpret it differently. Then there's Judaism. So their temple got destroyed in 70 AD, as Jesus prophesied himself. The Romans went to destroy it completely. So animal sacrifices no longer can be offered because the temple is gone, right? And because of that, the religion has become all about mastering the word now, mastering the Old Testament. And under the Jewish laws, right, there can be no more lawful atonement for sin because animal sacrifices have stopped, right? So their religion sort of became a bit dysfunctional in that sense. And many there are many prophecies in the Old Testament about all nations coming to know God and still completely unfulfilled. Judaism also has become a mishmash of liberal ideologies, although there is a conservative group that still exists. And they have been waiting for the Messiah for over 20 centuries. So yeah. And they rejected Jesus who fulfilled or is fulfilling all the prophecies wonderfully. Yep. So then we move on to Christianity. It's the most influential and largest religion in the world. It's most widespreading for all peoples and all races. It's not confined to a certain ethnic group. The Bible is the most popular and influential book in all of history. Its founding fulfills the Jewish Old Testament messianic prophecies. It was made hundreds of years before the Messiah came. So, for example, the prophet Isaiah, he existed 700 years before Jesus. He already talked about the suffering servant, how by stripes we shall be healed. All these things that Jesus fulfilled. Jesus himself prophesied, for example, his resurrection and destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 and other things like that. Jesus' existence is the most certain fact in all of antiquity, right? Virtually no scholar denies that Jesus existed. And Jesus himself, the founder, claimed to be God. He did miracles to show credentials. The followers were unlearned fishermen, but they taught the most influential teachings the world has ever known. The whole world is influenced by Christianity in terms of the calendar, in terms of the holiday seasons we have. The religious doctrines that they maintain are superior to the speculations of the greatest philosophers. So we know that it could not have originated with themselves because these people are just unlearned fishermen. And societies that were influenced by Christianity exhibited a state of moral purity, such as the world has never known before. Okay. And the disciples themselves, they endured terrible persecution and died horrible deaths to testify to the truth of the religion, except Apostle John. But that's just to show that they had nothing to gain from lying, right? If they wanted to lie or just wanted to become famous, they would not have endured terrible persecution and died for something they knew to be a lie. And there was also widespread conversion against all odds. Christianity technically should not exist because there was brutal and systematic persecution by the Roman government, and the Christians were surrounded by the culture of grave moral depravity, and yet it still spread everywhere without any violent tactics and human or political means. So the spreading of Christianity itself is a moral miracle. And so if all these supernatural results were produced without the aid of miracles, this, as St. Augustine argues, would be the greatest miracle of all. Yeah. Christianity is also the most intellectually robust and historically credible religion. It's also the most heavily scrutinized religion, yet it always remains standing, right? You'll notice that, I guess because Christianity is the most prominent, but you'll see that a lot of the atheists, they go after Christianity in particular. They don't really spend a lot of time with the Eastern religions because Christianity really is the most prominent. It's also the most intellectually robust. Yeah. Influence all of Western culture, such that critics that try to condemn Christianity, they also presuppose Christianity's own moral framework that they take for granted. So the Christian influence is really inescapable. It's unique amongst the great world religions because it teaches that God became man to die out of love, and it's really God's search for man rather than man's search for God. And it's really a very odd story to come up with, that God would become man to die out of love. So it doesn't seem very human, right? There's also many puzzling conversion stories of people becoming Christians due to alleged dreams, visions, miraculous events that lead to a radical change in their life. So, for example, there are stories of Islamic terrorists in the Hezbollah, for example, converting to Christianity, right? Which is very dangerous for them as well, yet they still convert. And you just don't really find these stories in other religions. And this data point must be accounted for somehow. And to dismiss all of it as just mere hallucination is really just dishonest. It doesn't properly account for the data point convincingly. So now we go to the question of which version of Christianity is the right one. So we have to establish that there's really three main branches of Christianity. Okay, there are three main branches. So there's the Protestant, the Catholic, and the Eastern Orthodox. So, I mean, there are still other smaller branches, like the Oriental Orthodox and the Assyrian Church of the East, but for our purposes, we'll focus on the main ones. So there are 900 million Protestants, 1 billion Catholics, so that's the biggest. And then Eastern Orthodox, 220 million. And we can see here majority of Christians are actually Catholic. There's the Protestants, the Orthodox, and the other Christians, the Oriental Orthodox, for example. So the Eastern Orthodox, okay, they lack doctrinal unity. They haven't really had ecumenical councils after their schism with Catholics in roughly 1054, right? And they also disagree what exactly are ecumenical councils. And as a result of that, they disagree on the most fundamental things like the requirements for baptism or rebaptism. So if you convert to Eastern Orthodox, into Eastern Orthodoxy, and you were a baptized Christian before that, you have to be baptized again. There's a question that they still haven't been able to answer. Same for chrismation, questions regarding divorce and remarriage, and how an ecumenical council is defined or identified. These are very fundamental and important questions, but after their schism, they haven't really been able to answer it properly or in a unified way. There are differing groups saying different things. They've also hardly spread since the schism. They mainly settled in Eastern Europe. So they haven't been faithful to Christ's Great Commission and the prophecies like in the Psalms that all nations shall glorify God's name. Yeah. And also gave in to contraception, divorce, and remarriage issue. These certain segments of the church actually give in. They also reject the filioque and the papacy, which the church fathers substantially upheld. These issues are actually quite complicated, right? But I don't think we'll touch on that too much. But I think the early church can be shown to hold these principles, these doctrines, filioque and the papacy. And there are also many schisms that occur between the different patriarchs in the Eastern Orthodox Church. It's also greatly influenced by geopolitics. It's also very geographically influenced. So a lot of people, you'll see that they're very similar nationality when they're part of their particular church. Yeah. So it's not very universal. Yeah. And for Protestants, I'll go a little bit more in detail for this one because I think a lot of people encounter them more than like the Eastern Orthodox, for example. So for Protestants, they came after the 1500s and they greatly fragmented Christianity into many denominations. Okay, so the fruits of that was there were countless schisms, disunity, confusion, and eventually it led to doctrinal relativism. The Protestants, they disagree on virtually every possible doctrine, even on the greatest matters. And you can't say that, oh, at least they agree on the essentials, because they disagree on what the essentials even are, right? The question things like whether baptism is required for salvation, whether Jesus is really present in the Eucharist, is once saved, always saved? Is that how it works? Who exactly is a Christian? They also differ on the Christology, Trinitarian theology, what exactly are the requirements for salvation, what faith alone really means, what sola scriptura really means also, nature of the church, sacraments, and all these things, right? Divorce, contraception, abortion, all that also. It's also virtually impossible for them to maintain a harmonious historical continuity with the historic and true church. They have to end up anathemizing a lot of the liturgies, the liturgical prayers in the historical church, which was used for centuries. I think, yeah, so they also have varying ideas of how, what happened to the church. Did it simply go apostate in the early centuries? Did it always exist, but a little bit more underground? So these are the things that they also contradict each other on. They contradict each other on when exactly Catholicism went bust. Did it go bust in Trent? Was it earlier? Was it later? So they really have varying narratives of the historical account. The reformers also contradict each other, and the followers of the reformer also reject and change views. So it's really like a pick and choose culture. They choose Christianity to suit one's own preferences. It's really a fruit of pride, right? We can't say Protestants can't say that Catholics also pick and choose whatever, because all the Catholic really does is to discern the true church, which can be done historically. But for the Protestant, he has to discern the entire deposit of divine revelation, including the canon, which is really impossible and impractical, right? And Yeah, Protestantism has no authority, no mechanism to reconcile doctrinal differences. So it's impossible really under the Protestant framework to bring about doctrinal unity. And that's because of the principle of sola scriptura, Bible alone. When you have the Bible alone, everybody interprets the Bible for themselves, and they are all on the supposedly equal authority of the Bible, right? So it's really your interpretation versus my interpretation. It's a deadlock. Once we disagree, right, there's no practical way to reconcile, right? So you can see this meme here, and it really degrades into theological relativism and toleration, right? But which is really just the absorption of varying errors. You can't maintain doctrinal purity. It also helped to give rise to secularism because the doctrinal differences, they couldn't be reconciled under the Protestant framework. So the different monarchs, they decided to um, just have a place, have like a secular place where religion isn't really talked about to sort of settle for peace, because if not, fighting will keep continuing. And Protestant churches also change doctrines over time. But we all know that the truth is doctrines cannot change. Truth is unchangeable, right? House built on shifting sand, not on rock. And honestly, most popular low church denominations are very, very far removed from the historic Christianity and even what the original reformers, the magisterial reformers, even had in mind, right? They didn't really want uh it to become this messy. Yeah. Also, the founders of Protestantism, they didn't do any miraculous deeds, nor did they display any levels of heroic sanctity. For example, King Henry, he murdered and divorced many wives of his, right? Murdered and divorced like 6 wives. Luther was vulgar and was tormented by scruples. Calvin was arguably a dictator in Geneva. So none of these people really showed that they were men that were being transformed by God. None of them that were um, showing any fruits of the Holy Spirit, really. And Protestantism also spread in very human and violent means, really born from a reaction against scandals and from the political and nationalistic desires of monarchs. They took advantage of all that because they didn't want to be under the authority of the Pope. So Protestantism really it's just basically the victory of people's natural desires over the supernatural. For example, they want certainty of salvation. The people's taking advantage of people's anger at corruption. They want to reject authority in doctrine out of pride, deny free will, and as a result, you will deny moral accountability. And this is for like some of the groups like Calvinism, certain forms of Calvinism. And yeah, the kings did not want to submit to a spiritual authority. And sola scriptura is also not in the Bible. Okay, sola scriptura is not in the Bible. A lot of Protestant scholars also do admit that it's not explicitly found in the Bible. At most, they go to Mark chapter 7, and they say that sola scriptura is implicitly found there. But Mark chapter 7 does not teach sola scriptura at all. Okay. And even if it was in the Bible, it would still be secular, because then you just believe in scripture just because scripture tells me to believe in scripture. Right? That's a logical fallacy. It's secular. Um, Luther couldn't find support from tradition, so he went with Bible alone, right? But yet he still tried to remove books from the Bible. So he wanted to remove various books from the New Testament, like Revelations, James, Hebrews, and all that. And just understanding that the canon of the Bible was discerned by the Catholic Church, right? You can't really discern the canon on your own, because like how will you go about doing that? It's yeah, how do you discern inspiration? How do you discern what is of divine revelation by purely human yeah, by purely human reason? It's just not really possible. And also, maintaining sola scriptura, Bible alone, contradicts the Bible's teaching on the infallible church, that there is another authority, which is the Catholic Church, right? For example, the Bible talks about the pillar and grounds of truth in 1 Timothy 3:15. In Matthew 18:16, Jesus also talks about how we should take it to the church whenever we have disagreements amongst our brethren. And if they would not even listen to the church, then you should treat him as an outcast, as a heathen, right? And that presupposes that the church is infallible. Because if not, Jesus would have never commanded us to treat our own brethren as a heathen. And because if it's a fallible church, then you have to unjustly do that. And Jesus would be encouraging an error or something that will be sinful, which is not possible. Yeah, and the early church also regularly held ecumenical councils and held the Pope's declaration to be definitive. Yeah, so it kind of goes against the idea of Bible alone. The early church was already um looking to the popes and ecumenical councils. You can see what's the big difference. The Catholic Church was founded by Jesus, and the other denominations they were founded by men, right? So all these different denominations. There's a lot more actually, but yeah. And now we come to Catholicism. So Catholicism built up Western civilization. It's the most influential and oldest institution in the world. Really the greatest force of good, although a lot of people don't know this. It's the most intellectually robust version by a long shot, right? It's the most intellectually robust version in terms of its scholasticism and um yeah, and has countless members of resplendent learning. You have Aquinas, Augustine, and many of the scholastics, right? Um, it also maintains continuity with the early church, right? Things regarding the Blessed Virgin Mary, popes, the hierarchy of the church, bishops and priests, the Eucharist, the Mass, all these things, and the veneration of the saints as well. It has the four marks of being one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. It's truly Catholic. Catholic means universal, right? So it's found in every land, every nation, transcends time and culture. It's not confined to just another geographical group. It also has various rites. It's not just Roman. It's not just the Roman rite. Right? There's the Byzantine in the eastern parts of Europe, uh the Coptic, the Syrian, the Roman. There's like 26 rites altogether, all of different organic developments in the different geographical regions. It's evangelized in everywhere and every place. So that's faithful to the Great Commission, and it still remains one in doctrine. It has unbroken lineage of successors of apostles, and yeah, so it maintains apostolic succession. The Pope keeps the church united and functional. So like unlike the other denominations and even Eastern Orthodoxy, who don't really function very well. The saints also display a heroic lives of sanctity, really beyond that of any other religion, really. Like if you read the lives of the saints, what they did, the teachings and doctrines are consistent, sublime, and holy. It never caves into the culture, right? Things regarding abortion, contraception, LGBTQ, we maintain a firm stance, we don't change, right? And even despite our size, we still remain one in doctrine. Okay, so we are consistent. And we really have incomparably more miracles than really any other religion. Greater in terms of the quantity and the magnitude. It's not even in the same ballpark as any other religious denomination, religion or denomination. And this is exactly what you would expect if Catholicism was divine, that God would show all his credentials and focus them on a certain religion. And there really is no killer critique against Catholicism that can be found. And I get that this sounds very biased, but I'm quite convinced of it. Like a lot of the Protestant arguments against Catholicism, they're based off misunderstandings. Even the Crusades also, a lot of people don't even know about the Crusades as well. And yeah, there really hasn't been any valid argument against Catholicism. Yeah, right. And Catholicism, like I said, is also faithful to the Old and New Testament prophecies. Um, all the ends of the earth will see the salvation of our God. This was from Isaiah, 700 years before Jesus came. And even in the New Testament, you shall be my witnesses even to the ends of the earth. And Catholicism is really in every continent, every country. Yeah. Even the miracles in Catholicism I mentioned, there are many scientifically verified miracles. Now we have a lot of the tools we can use to study and look into the different uh the different miracles. A lot of the media doesn't report it. For example, the incorruptible saints, they don't decay after centuries. So like Saint Padre Pio, Saint Vincent de Paul, Saint Catherine Labouré, Saint Bernadette, who died in the 1800s. So this is like 200 years old. Um, Miracles like Our Lady of Fatima, where 70,000 people came down, and a lot of them saw the dancing of the sun. They reported a phenomenon, right? And yeah, Our Lady of Guadalupe, where this miraculous image is formed, on the tilma, and it's not scientifically explainable how this image was formed because there's no paint or anything on it. Same for this, Our Lady of Las Lajas. It's a rock. This image is not actually a painting or anything. It's formed on the rock itself. Like, that means the rock itself formed this image. And geologists have seen that actually this image goes like several feet into the rock itself, like 6 feet into the rock. So they're so amazed at how this image was formed. It shows Our Lady giving the rosary to Saint Dominic and Saint Francis of Assisi being given his cords by Jesus. And the Eucharistic miracles, these also are scientifically verified to show that they are there is still living proteins inside of some of the blood that was tested, which is really remarkable because it's supposed to be decayed by now. And other things like miracles, the Hiroshima bombing, can't really see it, but the priests were survived the nuclear bombing in Hiroshima because they were praying the rosary every day, and no nuclear radiation was found in their bodies at all. Yeah. And yeah, many of the saints, they did many things like raise people from the dead, read people's heart, levitated, bilocated, interacted with demonic spirits and angels and all that kind of thing. So for more a deeper scientific study, right, you can see Father Robert Spitzer's work. He's on YouTube. Yeah, he shows you a lot of the evidence. And Catholicism is also built up Western civilization. I mentioned this just now. It's the largest non-governmental provider of charity, education, medical services, and social care in the world and throughout history, right? The Catholic Church founded charity organizations, hospitals, libraries, universities, orphanages, other social services. It contributed most to scientific advancement. A lot of people, I guess, miss this. It either founded or greatly developed virtually every field of knowledge, right? Okay, didn't found certain fields of knowledge, but things like a lot of scientific disciplines, you will see that it's founded by Catholic priests, Catholic monks. So things regarding architecture, music, law, international law, just war clauses, arts, political theory, econs, all these things. Yeah, the Catholic Church was really the backbone of Western civilization. Also built up Western morality, the idea of human rights that a lot of people take for granted, the intrinsic dignity of every person. This wasn't really maintained in the ancient world. Like the Romans, they would just kill people, like they'll commit infanticide when they see that you're not physically fit. Things like sexual morality, marital fidelity, these weren't common in the past. There's a lot of degrading ways that they mistreated a free Roman citizen, a free male Roman citizen could sexually use their subordinates, right? And that was just the norm. Yeah. So you can see that by their fruits you shall know them. That's what Jesus himself said. So yeah, and you can see it's quite a known thing that Catholicism did build up Western civilization. You can see these books like from Thomas E. Wood, Tom Holland, Dominion. Yeah. So the world really has a lot to thank the Catholic Church for. Right. And this other meme, right? Catholics are anti-science. This is just a myth. Like you see a lot of these people, Roger Bacon, he's basically the founder of the scientific the scientific method, right? Steno, he's basically the founder of modern day geology. Gregor Mendel also on genetics. Father George Lemaitre, he founded the Big Bang Theory. Yeah. And sometimes people mention Galileo. The Catholic Church did not suppress scientific development. It's a lot more of Galileo's findings. It's a lot more complicated than that. Actually, they affirmed his findings, and a lot of the Jesuit priests also celebrated his findings. And also on the moon, there are 30 craters that are like named after Jesuit priests because to recognize their contributions towards science. So all these things, yeah, people take for granted, but they don't realize that the Catholic Church really built up a lot of what we appreciate. So now we moved on to the question of why are there miracles in other religions? So It's because they can be influenced by the demonic to rob God of his glory. But it's also important to realize that demons can't really do real miracles. They only make it look like one. So because God is still fair, he restricts what they can or can't do to be fair to those who may be deceived. Because miracles are like God's signature to give him the credentials to verify that it's him alone. So you can't let demons deceive um, people. If not, the people also, they can't be blamed, right? So some miracles, right, they can be real, like real miracles that God himself does to help out a good and sincere person, but it's never to witness an error in the false religion that he's in, but to lead that person closer to the fullness of truth. But anyway, such miracles really hardly ever happen, and there's still nothing compared to the miracles that happen at Catholic Church. Like a lot of them that take place. Yeah. And yeah, a lot of the demonic miracles that happen, like people maybe speaking other languages, these are things that demons are known to do, and yet they aren't really real miracles. Yeah. And another question is, if other religions are false, right, how come they spread? So they can spread because really natural reasons, like unlawful means of spreading, like military conquest, purely human political factors, and naturally men, they just want to honor God in some way, as best as they know how. So when they grasp at religions insofar as it helps them fulfill this longing of worshipping God, because it's innate to man's nature, right? So because of that, they are also disposed to clinging to certain religions when they recognize certain truths in those religions, even though they may contain certain errors. So because of that, people themselves are already disposed to clinging to certain religions, religion in general, even if it's false altogether. Yeah. And there's also supernatural reasons that we cannot ignore, like demonic influence that perhaps helps to propagate it in some way, like dispose people to perhaps believe a certain lie or that sort of thing. To yeah, to rob God of his glory and that sort of thing. Yeah. So the supernatural reasons, they also play a part in some way. Another question is that why doesn't God make himself more obvious? I think really it's so that we can preserve our freedom to choose him. Because if he were to make himself so obvious to us, it would it will overwhelm our minds, right? And our will will not be involved anymore. It will just be our intellect. It will just be our heads, right? So he doesn't want to force us to believe in him, right? He wants to make place for the will. So both a sound mind and a sincere heart, the will, right, is needed to find the truth. We mentioned that earlier. So ultimately, I think it's also because he wants those with a sincere and humble heart to be able to find him. God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble. Jesus also says in the Bible, right? He says in the Gospels that, "Thank you, Lord, for hiding these things from the proud and revealing them to the children." Right. So, um, he wants people who sincerely seek the truth to be able to find him. So for that reason, he gives sufficient evidence to show that he is the that this religion is true, that his religion is true, the things he says is true, but he won't go all the way. Yeah. So he distances himself so that those who are sincere and open-minded will be able to find him. So those who seek shall find. Yeah. And another thing that I hear quite often is that people think that faith is blind. Faith is absolutely not blind. It is wrong to have blind faith in anything. Okay, God gave us the gift of a mind, of a rational nature, right? And if we don't act according to our own natures that he gave us, right, it's really to do violence to our own nature. And God is also not pleased with that, right? This whole idea of just have faith, there's a lot of wrong understandings of it. God gave us a rational mind, right? Why? As a tool to be able to discern the truth. So blind faith renders this duty impossible, and so it's wrong. So our duty is always to act rationally. And people don't realize that faith really is a rational act. Reason can never contradict faith. The use of your reason also helps your faith because it can remove arguments that that or obstacles against the faith that don't dispose you towards receiving the light of faith. When you see the arguments that support the Catholic faith, for example, they dispose you to believe, seeing that it's so rational, reasonable, seeing the different reasons seeing the different reasons that Catholicism is credible, disposes someone to believe. And faith has to do with truths from higher sources that cannot be known by reason alone. So faith is believing something because God, who is worthy of all trust, has revealed it to us. So that itself is a rational act. It's an act of trust. We trust people who are trustworthy, and God is the most trustworthy person of them all, right? So yeah, anyway, it makes no sense to say that faith is blind or faith is irrational, because the church itself proliferated the use of reason anyway, in its like universities and all that kind of thing in the Middle Ages. So yeah, and we have the greatest people of like learning like Aquinas, Augustine, and all the scholastics. Yeah. Yeah. So St. Augustine, for example, he says, God does not expect us to submit our faith to him without reason, but the very limits of our reason make faith a necessity. Right? We can't know everything by reason. There's some things that are too transcendent for us to know. Like things on the Trinity. We can by reason we can know that God is one. There's a transcendent and single cause for the universe. But we would have never been able to know that he is three in one, for example. Yeah. And we would not have been able to discern his will unless he expressly made it known to us what he wanted of us. So that's why we need the light of faith to believe in what God tells us. Yeah, and faith and reason are like two wings that help the man arrive at truth. Yeah. And so that's basically it. So that's how we can sort of discern that Catholicism is the true religion. There's really nothing that really comes close to what Catholicism has done. You can see that the other religions don't really match up to um yeah, the fruits of Catholicism, the reasons to believe in Catholicism, all the miracles that take place, how it has spread throughout the whole world for every nation, and all the good it's done for the world. Yeah. So with that, thanks for listening.